Hello and welcome once again, wherever you may be. There's been a subtle change in the seasons here in England. The air is no longer filled with the pollen and blooms, fragrances, and all the insects that chase themselves around in that fragrant mist. Everything has settled down and the air is suddenly very clear. You could call it the first fall. I was reflecting on this and several images emerged from my guts. The simpler beings, the plants, they act collectively like a great global dance. The blooms explode in this ecstasy in the summer as they get as close as they can to heaven, before gently falling once again to the earth to be ploughed under in the cycle. The animals are quite different. They have the sense of a body boundary. They flow with the seasons, giving birth with the spring and fasting in the winter. People are once again different, and they reflect the seasons in their own particular way. Gurdieff said something very moving about the animals, that they all wished to be people. This week I've been marvelling at just how unconscious human beings are, to the point where I don't feel I can blame them anymore, and I've been looking around for somebody else to blame for all my problems. Life keeps man asleep and draws all his force from him by a number of well-worn events with which he is always identified. But everyone must enter as if afresh and should pass through as many as possible of these different shows and side shows of the great circus on earth called life, so as to have plenty of material on rolls in the centres, plenty of experience, for otherwise the necessary contrast between life and this work is not possible. The hypnotism of life is at all times very powerful. The object of nature is to keep man asleep and keep him based on violence so that he serves the purposes of nature. The work is a force coming into life from conscious sources outside of life. Sir James Fraser was a Scottish fellow at Cambridge University who had collected together folklore and tradition from the British Empire. He wrote something very interesting about Genesis. Attentive readers of the Bible can hardly fail to remark a striking discrepancy between the two accounts of the creation of man recorded in the first and second chapters of Genesis. In the first chapter we read how on the fifth day of creation God created the fishes and the birds, all the creatures that live in the water or in the air, and how on the sixth he created all terrestrial animals, and last of all man, whom he fashioned in his own image, both male and female. From this narrative we infer that man was the last to be created of all living beings on earth, and incidentally we gather that the distinction of the sexes which is characteristic of humanity is shared also by the divinity. We take note of the statement that God created the lower animals first and human beings afterwards, and that the human beings consisted of a man and a woman produced to all appearances simultaneously, and each of them reflecting in equal measure the glory of their divine original. So far we read in the first chapter, but when we proceed to peruse the second chapter, it is somewhat disconcerting to come bolt on a totally different and indeed contradictory account of the same momentous transaction, for here we learn with surprise that God created man first, the lower animals next, and woman last of all, fashioning her as a mere afterthought out of a rib which he abstracted from man in his sleep. The order of merit in the first two narratives is clearly reversed. In the first narrative, the deity begins with fishes and works steadily up through birds and beasts to man and woman. In the second narrative, he begins with man and works downwards through the lower animals to woman, who apparently marks the nadir of the divine workmanship. And in this second version, nothing at all is said of man and woman being made in the image of God. We are simply told that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. The flagrant contradiction between the two accounts is explained very simply by the circumstance that they are derived from two different and originally independent documents, which were afterwards combined into a single book by an editor. Well, we are very fortunate to be students of Gurdieff, and therefore to understand the differences in the two journeys and their extreme significance to our lives, as illustrated here by Francis Rolls. The additional or lateral octave in the array of creation begins in the sun, he said. The sun, soul of the cosmic octave, begins at a certain moment to sound as do, sol do. It is necessary to realize that every note of any octave, in the present instance every note of the cosmic octave, may represent do of some other lateral octave issuing from it. Or it would be still more exact to say that any note of any octave may at the same time be any note of any other octave passing through it. In the present instance, sol begins to sound as do, descending to the level of the planets. This new octave passes into si. Descending still lower, it produces three notes, la, sol, fa, which create and constitute organic life on earth in the form that we know it. Mi of this octave blends with mi of the cosmic octave, that is, with the earth, and re with the re of the cosmic octave, that is, with the moon. We at once felt that there was a great deal of meaning in this lateral octave. First of all, it showed that organic life represented in the diagram by three notes had two higher notes, one on the level of the planets and one on the level of the sun, and that it began in the sun. This last was the most important. Well, I was contemplating this in the shower this morning, and once again I had a sudden insight rising from my guts, or from the fusion, and the image was that this was an exact representation. Even if you're an angel, your work is not of the lowest story, it is of the middle story. That is the work of the day, that all creatures have to do. And if there is no sun above, then they do it automatically, passively. But if the sun is there, it becomes illuminated, and they are present themselves, and then it becomes for them. And this work is happening inside the octave of descent, and the lateral occurs at the first gap, but there is a second gap, which is the place of falseness. On the earth, societies lose contact with the star, with the prime symbol that had motivated it. The false growths on this planet, you can see them everywhere in the West today. Almost everything that is said reverses reality, and sometimes in rather ridiculous ways. The fuel for the false world that we see growing in the West today is the highest shock level, created by reversing reality to the greatest extent, which is why you see, for instance, previous men racing against women in the Olympics and all the other absurd things. There is no way to improve this situation unless the star is rediscovered, if that's even possible. Fraser was raised in the Free Church of Scotland, an offshoot sect, and like many who grew up in this way, in later life turned to rend it. And his works were typical of the era of colonialist authors, who with their newfound scientific institutions worshipped the noble savage, and today in England you can see their ideologies finally play out as the whole country is washed through with them. It's the same with Gurdjieff's teaching. First they said that they were only interested in the psychological teaching and discarded all of the cosmology. Later they discarded any of the hard work and super efforts, and finally it was all about being in the present moment and not being negative, as they reached absolute zero. Gurdjieff says, imitation work of this kind gives a great deal of self-satisfaction. One man feels himself to be a teacher, others feel that they are pupils, and everyone is satisfied. No realization of one's nothingness can be got here, and if people affirm that they have it, it is all illusion and self-deception, if not plain deceit. On the contrary, instead of realizing their own nothingness, the members of such circles acquire a realization of their own importance and a growth of false personality. I was looking for a quote, but I couldn't find it, but it was to the effect that as projects continue through time, the label remains, but the inner content changes, it deflects, it descends the octave, but the label remains. The label seems to live in a different world that contributes massively to the illusions of the earth. I can offer several ideas. The first is that in the octave, that the mental vibrations are more resistant to deterioration, and that's why the label remains. Another interesting fact is that although it may not seem to decay, it is decaying because the idea is actually held within people, and one day you will see the books get burned or replaced or vanish from publishing. That happens when the knowledge that was contained inside the population itself has vanished. Then the manifestation vanishes afterwards. In other words, all manifested labels, knowledges, and symbols actually reflect a living current that is held within beings, whether it is known or unknown. Another thing, I was contemplating the meaning of the symbol of the Virgin Mary. I had the sense that what it means is that if a woman really is very pious, that she will naturally, according to law, receive a child from a higher force, and that is just a natural law of existence, which is rarely seen on this planet. I've been working a lot with difficult feelings. It seems to me that they are simply not received, and if people feel bad, what is happening is they are tugging on the outside. In other words, they have only just entered your field of experience, and they become stored there, if you like. And if somebody pushes your buttons, they just re-trigger them. but they are not passed through, and in order to pass through you have to grow, you have to learn to feel difficult things. It is true that you need some control to observe things and to separate yourself so that you're not drowning in them. That is true, that is the first step of being awake. But it is only the first, and there are many things that a man has to do when he wakes up at the fifth, because it is for the first time that he is able to start cleaning the house, a house that has never been cleaned and contains a large amount of debris. And the last thing is that a couple of karmic events happened to me this week, positive and negative. I recognize as they come out of the blue and directly follow various other things that they are karmic events or adjustments from the outside. They always shock me in their scale because they are not like meeting a negative person where you can see who is doing it. Those adjustments happen on a much larger scale. Possibly they are travelling through the framework of life. I'm not certain. And the other thing is that they are personal, which is quite shocking. For instance, Gurdieff was personally targeted, which is quite difficult to imagine because for life to keep a watch on every single person here would be an exhausting job. In any case, we live under a great many illusions, and the final accounting seems to be based upon the level of your energetic transformation and purification, and on that basis do you receive. So it seems that being God-fearing, as they say, is meaningful. My Guru Maharaj used to say, "This material world is a society of cheaters and cheated, that's all. A combination of cheater and cheated. I want to be cheated because I accept this material world in place of God, so I accept its tricks. If there is a God, then I become responsible for my sinful life. So I deny God. There is no God, God is dead, finished. Then why don't they search for real knowledge? They are rascal. Why they are rascal? They will not take real knowledge. Just like children, they are obstinate. The father says, don't touch this. But he says, no, I will touch. And then he gets burned.